I pledge allegiance to the Christian flag and to the Savior for whose kingdom it stands, one Savior, crucified, risen, and coming again, with life and liberty for all who believe.
They say that the United States, there's no such thing as separation of church and state. The Constitution was never meant to imply that, and that the Founding Fathers were all good practicing Christians. Is this part of their lies?
The history of that is not true. I thought we had all been taught just the reverse of that in school, in college, graduate school, and all. But the two paths, Robertson and Buchanan, spew forth ideas very often about the idea that God intended this government to be completely Christian. Huey Long said it best, I think, at least it's attributed to him. He said that if fascism is ever to come to the United States, it will come on the backs of flag-waving Christians.
Maybe that's why he was shot. What is so interesting about this is that the Founding Fathers, most of them were deists. They weren't Christians at all. And a lot of them were Masons, and yet a lot of the religious right just got furious about Freemasons and Freemasonry, and yet it was a lot of these people who were the Founding Fathers. So it's such a curious contradiction there.
Well, in the 1600s, the United States was quite a religious country. In the 1600s, they were escaping religious prosecution. And then at the end of the 1600s, these same people became the prosecutors themselves. So by the 1700s and 1720, when our Constitution was actually written, the founders of our Constitution were non-religious. The Constitution only mentions religion once. And that is simply to say that if you're a politician, then your religion doesn't have anything to do with your election.
Yeah, there's no religious requirement for holding office.
Which would be directly against the Christian Coalition's philosophy. You can't have the Constitution as it is and the religious coalition in the same country. The religious right leaders claim that the liberals and the communists came forth with the idea that the United States was not a Christian, founded as a Christian country. But let's, I hope it's not too tedious, but let's look at the history of that for a moment. They did have a large influence on the forming of the United States. Their Christianity was there. Massachusetts became a colony where religious dissenters such as Baptists, Quakers, Catholics, and Jews and non-congregationalists were taxed and fined and arrested and publicly flogged and banished and even hanged for their religious beliefs. The good side, though, of the early United States, while Massachusetts was a hotbed of religious persecution, Roger Williams and Dr. Clark established Rhode Island as a lively experiment in religious liberty.
Yeah, the religious liberalism and pluralism at the time, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, whatever name they were, King Charles II of England granted a colony charter for Rhode Island on the 8th of July, 1663, for religious liberty. Now, the result of this charter were that Rhode Island was a safe haven for all persons of all expressions of religious faith or lack thereof. None were persecuted for his religious beliefs, something unusual for the United States. At the time of the founding of the 13 colonies, though, only 5 to 7% of the population identified themselves with any church.
Any church at all? Mm-hmm. Wow.
Mm-hmm. The radical religious right enjoys telling people that 9 of the original 13 colonies were Christian. Again, there's a big difference between the 1600s and the 1700s in the United States.
So they were during the 1600s, by force, if no other reason. But then by 1700s,
it wasn't anti-religious, but it was non-religious when the Constitution was written. As early as 1650, the colonialists like Roger Williams and John Clark recognized the value of keeping the church and the state separate.
Reverend Falwell, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for, well, there are no words to describe a welcome such as you've given me here. It's a real pleasure to be with so many who firmly believe that the answers to the world's problems can be found in the Word of God.
Ronald Reagan became the political messiah of the religious right.
So what did you suggest to the president?
I suggested that we take his interpretation of traditional values and require them of all government employees. That would include school teachers. School teachers would have to teach the traditional values that our president talks about and 80% of our American people believe in. That would be the moral standard for the public schools, for the television networks, and for government employees. Those are all people that are paid one way or another or controlled by the government.
Jerry Falwell, in his revisionistic view of America's founding fathers, declares that our nation was founded under God, by God, and for God. But the Constitution does not mention God at all. Article 4th, it states that no religious test shall be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So here, the religious right now is breaking the law, saying that only their people are to be elected. That's the only people they will vote for.
And even the Declaration of Independence just referred to Creator. It didn't say a thing about the Christian God or any other God. It just said Creator, which reflected their deist ideas of a unmoved mover, just one God who kind of created everything and weren't able to understand who it was or what it was, but the Indians call it the Great Mystery. And then once this creation was made, they said, okay, you're on your own, do it. These were the deists. They weren't Christians at all.
Did you know that Thomas Jefferson wrote his own Bible? He knew Hebrew and Greek and wrote his own Bible?
No, I did not.
He did. It was an exclusive Bible. It left out all references to the miraculous. It left Jesus Christ in the tomb, and it focused primarily on the ethical teachings of the Old and New Testament and the Sermon on the Mount. That was Jefferson's Bible. He was a once-born man whose genius was to bring the Puritans from the right and the religious dissenters from the left, like Baptists and Quakers, and unite them all into one government. That was his genius.
And yet he was just vilified by the Christians when he was running for office against John Adams. And they were saying he was an atheist and he wouldn't discuss his religious preferences and all. And he was saying, hey, church-state separation, you know, religion has nothing to do with this. And because he was at that time a Class B atheist, a deist at least.
A lot of examples like this need to be brought up, but one in particular, Jerry Falwell claims that Benjamin Franklin had an impassioned plea before the 1787 Constitutional Convention to disband for a few days and pray and then come back together and begin each session with prayer. Jerry Falwell says that this happened, and that as a result of this, we had a complete writing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It's a beautiful story, but unfortunately, it's not consistent with the historical facts. The notes of the debate in the Federal Convention of 1787 by James Madison renders this account. On Thursday, the 28th of June, 1787, Franklin did make an impassioned plea seeking divine guidance. And then he moved that the prayers employing the assistance of heaven and blessings of our deliberations be held in the assembly before we proceed to business. No mention of Christian, but Madison records show that Alexander Hamilton and others opposed this motion, and so a compromise motion was made that the convention request a sermon be preached on July the 4th, 1787, and from then on to begin daily meetings with prayer. Some members attempted to postpone this motion silently through adjournment. After several unsuccessful attempts, the adjournment was carried out without any vote on the motion, and the motion was not taken up again on Friday, the 27th of June, the next day, when the convention reconvened. And Franklin then himself noted that with the exception of 3 or 4 others, most of the representatives thought prayers were unnecessary. The convention did not adjourn for 2 days, nor did they use prayers exclusively to open the convention's daily meetings. Likewise, the Bill of Rights was not introduced or ratified until after the states ratified the Constitution.
So that's Madison himself talking. Madison, of course, is one of the central founding fathers, and he was there at the time. Now, Falwell wasn't there, I assume.
The radical religious right claims that the formers of the Constitution were deeply religious people, with 52 of the 55 alleged to have been Orthodox evangelical Christians.
Oh, my God.
But listen to the following account from Clinton Royster, the historian of the 1787 Constitutional Convention. He says that, speaking of the Christians there, the gathering at Philadelphia was largely made up of men in whom the old fires were under control or even flickered out. Most were nominal members of one of the traditional churches in their part of the country, and most were men who could take their religion or they could leave it alone. But no one would dare proclaim that his opinions had the support of the God of Abraham and Paul. The convention of 1787 was non-religious. Accordingly, the document produced was a rationalistic document that did not mention God. Now, Luther Martin, on the other hand, at that time, brought up a motion to show preference to those who were Christians.
Oh, he was a member of the convention?
And the 1787 convention rejected his views and presented the Constitution to the 13 colonies as a non-religious document. So the idea was brought up and voted on. Let's take the letter to the Danbury Baptist Association that's been quoted so often by the Supreme Court.
Now, when was this? Danbury?
This was immediately after the Bill of Rights was written.
Oh, okay.
And the people were trying to interpret it as to what it meant and so forth in the First Amendment. Thomas Jefferson did write this explanation of the First Amendment to the Danbury Baptist Convention. The radical religious right claims that this is just an offhand note being written hastily so that they could gain some political momentum. However, looking at the facts of the matter, the time is 1802. Jefferson's president of the United States. He's under fire from conservative religious leaders for his strong views on religious liberty. So he seeks the advice of his attorney, whose name is Levi Lincoln. His attorney and he compose these comments and present them to the Danbury Baptist, which states in part that the act, and then he quotes the law, make no law representing the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free use thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, unquote.
That was many, many years before the Supreme Court made a definitive statement on this in 1946, or was it 48? I forget.
But they used the Danbury statement as part of their evidence.
Those who thought differently were branded the enemy.
Well, where does the deception of the New Age movement and Eastern religions lead? There's no greater example than a country where there are 350 million people in grinding poverty. That nation, India, a nation fallen prey to idolatry.
New Age mysticism, Hinduism, occultic practices, idol worship. These practices are woven into the fabric of one of the oldest and most populous nations on earth, India. For the past 20 years, America has imported and mainstreamed these same beliefs and practices. What has been the cost for this kind of idolatry? Is India's grinding poverty, disease, and desperate squalor the price that India has paid? And could America be next?
Other opinions were not tolerated. Books that they thought undermined America's moral values were burned.
Hey, let's make a movement out of there!
To burn!
No one should have any of this stuff!
They declare that since the 1962 and 63 Supreme Court decisions prohibiting state-mandated prayer and Bible reading, the public school performance has declined and social ills have increased. The idea being that the first event caused the second. If one is going to say that, you could just as easily say that 8 years earlier the phrase "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and therefore this is what caused the decline in values of the United States.
And in name of Christian righteousness, they supported apartheid in South Africa and the Contras in Central America.
This is one of the most moving experiences in my life to be here today.
Esto ha sido una de las experiencias más conmovidas en mi vida.
To see your faith,
Para ver su fe,
your desire for freedom and liberty,
el deseo que tienen para la libertad,
your courage,
su coraje
and your discipline.
y su disciplina.
We want to help those who are the victims of communism.
Queremos ayudar a las víctimas del comunismo.
Russia, nation in conflict, God's instrument to fulfill end-time prophecy.
In the mid-1980s, they were vehemently opposed to a nuclear freeze. I didn't get it. How could Christians take this position? Why were they so enthralled by the image of war? I decided to examine what seemed to be at the center of their beliefs, their vision of the end time, the apocalypse.
The eternal plan of Almighty God. Russia, World War III, and Armageddon.
The description here is of a time in which the nation of Israel has been regathered. That's now. And there's an involvement with Sidon and Tyre. That's going on in Lebanon right now. And these events, according to the prophet Joel, are to lead on up to the battle of Armageddon.
That summer, while thousands of Christians marched for disarmament, end-time preachers like Hilton Sutton talked with great ease about nuclear weapons. It was all part of the inevitability of their scenario for the end time.
The day is going to come in which the Soviets will attempt an invasion of the state of Israel. Many of us within our theological field refer to it as World War III. It will only last a day, just a 24-hour period. It's described for us very vividly in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. It comes at the very onset of that 7-year period that we refer to as the tribulation, the apocalyptic era.
Do you think that nuclear weapons will be involved in the destruction of Russia?
It is nuclear. It has to be nuclear weapons.
The planet Earth is dying. The disease is sin.
These scenes from an evangelical movie about the end times spell out what happens next. 7 horrible years of oppression follow. In Western Europe, the Antichrist rises to total power. Fortunately, true Christians do not suffer through the years of tribulation. They are taken from earth to heaven in the rapture.
The shocked world will discover suddenly that what the Bible said was true, that he will come as a thief in the night.
The tribulation culminates in a cataclysmic battle which takes place in Armageddon.
Together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue, Armageddon.
But Christ returns to earth with his saints and triumphs over all. Professor Robert Jewett saw in this scenario the rationale for the hardline political stance of the religious right.
What's characteristic about this new apocalypticism is that it is connected up with a view of history and of theology, which says that the ethic of the Sermon on the Mount and the ethic of equal justice is for the millennium. It's for the future. What we must do now, according to this theology, is be firm in the faith and, in effect, hate the enemy and be prepared to destroy the enemy. There's a very great unwillingness to compromise.
We are moving in to a major conflict in the United States of spiritual warfare as great as any that has ever occurred in the history of the church. Believe me, the early church fought no spiritual battles any greater than the one that began on January 1st of this year and will intensify over the next weeks and months up until Election Day in November 1984. It is spiritual warfare from this place and this time henceforth.
If this was the very last day of my life, I would not cry, 'cause I've been waiting for it.
What seemed like a terrifying scenario to me is a happy message for the fundamentalists. They won't have to suffer. Christ evacuates them to heaven. Too bad for people like me, who are left behind. That summer I met Skip Porteous. He had been a minister of this fundamentalist church, but he had left it after a crisis of faith. Alarmed by the political activities of his former fundamentalist friends, he decided to expose the agenda of the religious right.
I really used to believe in the end times. I think that's one reason I had such fervor in my preaching, because I thought we were living in the last days and people either had to shape up or ship out. It was, it was a pretty serious thing that out of all of human history, that this was it, this was the end, and it was all going to be over pretty soon. I certainly understand the religious right better than any layperson, and probably as much as any preacher in America. I mean, I know the mindset, I know the way they think, I know the agenda. I know the whole thing. I was part of it, you know, so I thought it was laughable at first that these people thought they could take over the country for the Lord, and then they really started doing some things. For instance, in 1984, they showed up at the Republican convention in Dallas, and were really trying to take over the Republican Party. And so at that point, my wife and I really got concerned, and we thought we'd do something about it. We started writing a newsletter called The Freedom Writer, to warn people about the agenda of the religious right and to defend the separation between church and state.
By the end of 1984, end-time theology had even penetrated the White House.
What do they actually believe in then, the radical right here, in, the religious right in the United States?
They believe whatever they're told to believe by the televangelists and the people behind the heavy direct mail campaigns.
Do the fundamentalists in the United States want to establish the Bible as law?
Oh yes, that's what they say, yes.
There are other things, I guess, too. They want to change education too, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Heavy on education. I expect that's why they want to get rid of the individual parenting for orphans and establish orphanages so they could gather these people under one fundamentalist type of orphanage and snap their minds there so they will go out and become proper Christian Coalition followers.
The book, The Holy Terror, says that with their propaganda and all, they said there's no exchange of ideas, it's just pure propaganda, and it's the first total propaganda in U.S. history, and it's masquerading as religion. This is the first complete package of propaganda that's ever been foisted on the American people. So it is scary, and the people are susceptible to it. That's what amazes me. Are they able to get people hooked who are already religious but not fundamentalist, and then they can make inroads into their already credulous outlook because they do have some religious beliefs, and so they steer them in their direction, or they can they do this with anybody?
Theoretically, they can do it with anyone. No, they really have to take over the church and get the minister to do this. They're being very well trained by the Christian Coalition. We have recordings of the people doing this on how to take over a church, how to get the minister kicked out, put a new minister in. So to answer your question, no, I don't think the normal church is susceptible to it until the Christian Coalition comes in and replaces the minister with one of theirs.
Well, let's go at a higher level than just the church level. And that is, we were talking a little bit about Reagan a while ago. Reagan opened the door, and Pat Robertson even said that he was talking with God, and God told him to support Reagan and not to criticize Reagan. Of course, he later ran his own campaign, but nonetheless, that came right down that he was supposed to support Reagan. But Reagan did bring in a whole lot of people from the religious right, including a Secretary of Defense, a lot of high office holders and appointees, and Lynn Nofziger, the original press secretary for Reagan, actually coordinated a lot of his activities with the religious right. And there were a lot of organizations which were set up to bring the religious right together with people from the military-industrial complex. Some of the highest military officials were under this particular control and this mindset, which was scary as hell. People who are apocalyptic in outlook, a lot of them would say back then in the Reagan years, hey, World War III is all right because it's going to bring Jesus back.
Mm-hmm.
And
the eschatology of those people is not scriptural at all.
And then they got involved in a lot of activity in support of some of the most horrible repressive regimes in the world, like in Central America, in Guatemala, where one of their own, General Rios Montt, who was a member of one of the fundamentalist churches in California, he took over as head of Guatemala, and they had just slaughtered the indigenous populations by the thousands and thousands. And there's some of the reports in the Covert Action Information Bulletin that some of these right-wing religious people were actually helping in these campaigns of slaughter, and also participated in torture. And what they were saying was, no, we're not killing real ordinary people, we're killing communists, and we're killing Indians because Indians are possessed by the devil.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you depersonalize a person, you can kill them without, or torture them without any feeling yourself.
Like the Islamics kill Christians in Egypt right now.
Yeah, it is really, really scary.
This concludes the first of our